You pressed play, but something else might be listening too. Can I ask you something? Where are you right now? And what time is it there? Tell me in the comments. Just don't listen too closely. Some things hear it when you do. In the autumn of 1806, a modest farmhouse had been erected on the outskirts of a remote settlement nestled deep within the Appalachian foothills of southern Kentucky. The land, recently cleared of dense maple and ash forest, had been purchased by a man named Elias Rourke. With him had arrived his wife Miriam and their 7 children, Nathaniel, Josiah, Lemuel, Silas, Ruth, Elijah, and the youngest, Margaret. The soil had been rich and dark, promising good harvests. It had seemed the perfect place to begin anew after years of hardship in Virginia, but something had felt wrong from the start. The wind that moved through the trees whispered in a tongue that did not belong to the living. Animals grew sick without cause. Neighbors avoided the stretch of land where the Rourke family had chosen to settle, crossing themselves when they passed the gate. Shortly after their arrival, peculiar disturbances began to unfold within the house, subtle at first. One of the boys had reported a strange breeze inside his room, despite closed windows. Another claimed to have seen a dark shape dart between the trees near dusk, its form too slender and swift to be any known creature. It had been Elijah who first discovered the entrance to the cave, tucked behind the barn and half buried beneath thorny brambles. The narrow mouth of stone had yawned open like the throat of something ancient. The boy had entered on a dare, clutching a lantern, while the others watched from above. He had not ventured far before stumbling across a collection of bones tucked into a natural crevice, small, dry, and brittle. One of the femurs had been cracked down the middle. Between them had rested a single molar, still partially embedded in the soil. The tooth had been pocketed, passed between curious hands, and eventually brought into the house. For reasons never explained, it had been dropped between 2 floorboards near the hearth. By the next morning, a hollow knocking had echoed beneath the planks. Each night thereafter, new sounds joined the first. A dragging noise like heavy cloth over stone, thumping like fists against timber, the delicate flutter of wings inside closed walls. At times it had seemed as though breath could be felt at the napes of necks, cold and deliberate. When nothing living had been found upon searching, suspicion had turned to the supernatural, but no one had dared to speak of it aloud, not even Elias, whose pride outweighed his growing unease. Weeks passed, and the noises had grown more assertive. Margaret, barely 12, had begun to show signs of distress. Her sleep had been disturbed by invisible hands tugging at her sheets. Her hair had been found twisted in knots upon waking. Once, her fingernails had been discovered broken, as though she'd clawed at something unseen in the night. On the second Sunday of November, the voice had been heard for the first time, not a voice spoken aloud, but one pressed like pressure against the minds of those who listened. It had come while the family sat in silence, gathered near the hearth. The flames had bent sideways, as if pushed by unseen breath, and the scent of earth and mildew had filled the air. I am the spirit of one buried beneath. My tooth has been taken. I will not rest until it is returned. Panic had spread through the household, though none had spoken of the words aloud, as though giving them voice would grant them permanence. The floorboards had been pried open, the tooth retrieved and carried back to the mouth of the cave. It had been placed on a stone slab just beyond the threshold. That night, silence had returned, but peace had not. In the weeks that followed, a new sensation had crept into the house, not one of noise, but of presence. Rooms had felt colder when entered. Candles had flickered without breeze. The mirrors had begun to fog from within. Ruth had awoken one night to find her feet bare and cold, the soles of them blackened with soil. Her bed had been made with perfect precision, as though untouched. The door to the house had remained bolted. There had been no sign of how she had moved. And then the voices had returned. Not just one, but many. Some low and guttural, others thin and high, like the cries of distant children. They had spoken not in English, but in a cadence no one recognized. Yet meaning had been felt: accusation, anger, grief. Margaret had suffered the worst. Her eyes had grown dim, as though her mind had retreated. Her limbs had bruised without impact. At times she had been lifted from her bed and hurled against the far wall. Screams had filled the night, yet the voice of the spirit had remained eerily calm, repeating only one phrase in a language no one knew, over and over. And still Miriam had remained untouched. She had fallen ill one night, coughing violently and requesting chestnuts from the forest. The next morning, they had been found piled at the foot of her bed, clean, polished, and warm to the touch. It had been clear then that something had made a choice. Snow had begun to fall in thick, damp sheets by late December, muting the air and softening the landscape into a ghostly white. The farmhouse had seemed swallowed by silence, its edges blurred in frost. But within those walls, the quiet had not meant peace. The Rourke children had been separated by sleep schedules and fear. Margaret had been moved into Ruth's room, in the hopes that proximity would shield her from further torment. Yet it had only deepened. The presence had not faded with the return of the tooth to the cave. It had merely changed, grown, adapted. Scratches had begun to appear on the walls. At first they had seemed like the careless marks of nails or rodents, but with each day the lines had taken shape. Symbols had emerged, circles with slashes through them, spirals ending in jagged breaks, marks that pulsed with an unsettling familiarity, despite being unreadable. No one had dared trace them with their fingers. The livestock had refused to enter the barn. Chickens had stopped laying. The horse had been found drenched in sweat, its eyes wide with unblinking panic, as though it had seen something too great to comprehend. The dog, an aging mutt named Alder, had vanished one night and been found 2 days later beside the creek, unmoving, its limbs splayed at impossible angles. Nathaniel, once the most skeptical of the siblings, had begun sleepwalking. He had been found outside barefoot on more than one occasion, murmuring unintelligible words, his eyes open yet unseeing. When awakened, he had no memory of his actions, but often complained of dreams in which water had risen over the floorboards, and hands had reached up from beneath to pull him under. Miriam, still untouched by the malevolence, had grown withdrawn. She had begun to spend her nights seated by the fireplace, whispering into the flames. Her eyes had remained fixed on a corner of the ceiling no one else had dared look at for long. In the presence of her children, her voice had sounded kind, measured, but her fingers had trembled constantly, as though something unseen clung to her wrists. In early January, the knocking had returned. This time it had carried a rhythm, deliberate, intelligent, and mocking. It had mimicked footsteps when no one moved. It had pounded like fists when someone prayed. It had thudded directly above beds when eyes had just begun to close. Elijah, frightened but defiant, had nailed a crucifix to the frame of his door. By the next morning, it had been found split in two, the nails bent backward, as though forced out by something inside the wood. Visitors had become rare. News of the Rourke family's trouble had begun to spread, but no one had believed them fully. Superstition had walked the town in whispers, but action had not followed. They had been left to endure it alone, and so they had endured. By candlelight, they had started to record the events in a ledger bound in leather. It had begun with careful dated notes of occurrences, scratches, voices, footsteps, but soon the handwriting had shifted. Pages had become frantic, the ink blotted with shaking hands. Entire nights had been lost to the scratching of quill on paper, as someone no longer sure who had tried to catalog the descent. In the second week of January, Ruth had awakened with bruises in the shape of fingers wrapped around her ankles. Her hair had been cut unevenly at the nape, as though she had been lifted by it. Margaret had begun to scream in her sleep, her voice rising to a pitch unnatural for her age. She had stopped speaking altogether during the day. Elias had attempted to remove them all from the house, loading what belongings they could into the wagon, but the horses had refused to approach the yoke. Not even whips had spurred them forward. One had collapsed to the ground with a bellowing cry, blood pouring from its nostrils, dead before it hit the snow. The family had remained. One evening, just past midnight, Josiah had noticed the smell, a burning odor, acrid and bitter, like charred hair and sulfur, had filled the air. The fireplace had gone cold, yet smoke had coiled upward from beneath the floorboards. The boards themselves had pulsed with heat. When Elias had pried one loose, no fire had been found, only soil. But within that soil, something had been moving, something had been breathing. They had sealed the plank back in place. The smell had lingered for hours. By the end of the month, the entity had grown bold. Windows had shattered from the inside. Lamps had been overturned by no visible hand. At times, the house had trembled, as if something massive had brushed against it from below. Yet outside, the ground had remained still, the snow undisturbed. It had been during one of these tremors that Lemuel had seen her. She had stood at the far edge of the property, where the tree line thickened and the fog rose like steam from the forest floor. She had not moved. Her face had been obscured by her long black hair, and her hands had hung at her sides, fingers extended. No footprints had led to her position. None had followed her departure, and though none had spoken of it, all who had seen her had known she was not living. February arrived with ice-laden winds and skies, the color of iron. The Rourke farmhouse had stood beneath that heavy sky like a monument to something lost, its windows blind, its doors swollen with moisture. Yet within something had thrived, something had waited. The nights had become unbearable. Whatever inhabited the house no longer limited itself to tricks and sounds. Its presence had begun to press on the family's skin, crawling like frostbite through their limbs. The feeling of being watched had escalated to something far more visceral, as if invisible eyes hovered just inches from their faces, observing every breath, every blink. Elijah had ceased to speak entirely. When addressed, he had only stared, lips parted as though sound might form, but never did. His hands had been found bruised and raw, the skin beneath his fingernails torn, though no memory remained of what he had done. Margaret's body had withered, her cheeks had hollowed. Her eyes, once filled with light, had dulled into a fogged gray. Her lips had moved constantly in whispered repetition, words no one recognized, but that carried weight, as if they summoned something each time they were spoken. The markings on the walls had grown darker. They had begun to appear on the ceiling, spreading in tangled branches from the corners like veins through flesh. Some had dripped, a dark resinous liquid that hardened upon drying but gave off the smell of decay. More disturbingly, the family had discovered objects misplaced, or rather placed with intention. Shoes had been found on the bed. Cutlery had been stacked into perfect spirals on the kitchen floor. A small child's doll that had belonged to Ruth had been discovered impaled on the stair rail, its porcelain face cracked, its eyes missing. The sound of chains had joined the nightly cacophony, not dragged across floorboards, but lifted, suspended and swaying, as if swung by unseen hands in the rafters above. The source had never been located, even when the attic had been searched in full daylight. Visitors had dwindled to none. Elias had taken to standing by the front door with a rifle, as though bullets could wound what had no flesh. Miriam had begun to sew endlessly, patching clothing that no one had worn in years, her fingers trembling, her stitches too tight. No one had dared interrupt her. The air around her had grown colder than the rest of the house. On the night of February 13th, a sound unlike any other had filled the house. It had begun as a low hum, almost mechanical, resonating through the beams and floor. Then it had risen, layered tones inhuman in harmony, vibrating through the bones of the family as they sat paralyzed in their separate rooms. When it had ceased, a new scar had appeared across the dining table, burnt into the wood, carved with heat, a mark like a serpent eating its own tail. In the days that followed, Silas had taken ill. His skin had turned ashen, his breath shallow. Nothing had been found in his lungs. No fever had burned in his brow, yet his body had wasted as though consumed from within. He had passed in the early hours of the morning, with no final cry, no goodbye, just a slow exhale and the stillness that followed. His body had been buried behind the house, beneath the lone elm tree that had resisted the winter winds. No preacher had attended, no blessing had been spoken. That night, the entity had laughed, not as a person would, but as 1,000 voices overlapping in chaotic rhythm, young and old, male and female, rising and collapsing upon one another. The walls had shuddered with it. The family had cowered, and above them, in the attic, footsteps had paced steadily back and forth until dawn. Margaret had not risen from bed again. Her body had remained limp, though her eyes had stayed open. They had followed nothing, fixated on the same corner of the ceiling that had so often drawn Miriam's gaze. Her lips had still moved, reciting her strange mantra in a cadence more ancient than familiar. And then something had shifted. On February 26th, a traveler had arrived, a man named William Calder, a scholar from Pennsylvania who had heard rumors of the events and come seeking truth or spectacle. He had not believed in spirits, not truly, though his books had been filled with accounts of them. He had been granted shelter by Elias, desperate for any outside help. He had stayed only 2 nights. During his stay, Calder had taken detailed notes, examined the structure, and sat with Margaret as she murmured her phrases. He had interviewed each member of the family by candlelight, his expression unreadable as he listened. On his second night, he had placed a tin basin of water in the center of the floor, and sprinkled salt around it, whispering a blessing known only to his ancestors. By morning, he had been found outside, barefoot, his hands covered in soil and blood. The tin basin had been shattered, the salt had vanished. Calder had departed without a word, his horse moving at full gallop toward the frozen horizon. He had never returned. March had arrived with no thaw, no relief. The air had grown heavier, dense with moisture and dread. The house had begun to rot from the inside. Wooden beams had wept a thick, amber-colored sap that reeked of iron. Walls had sagged without structural cause. No matter how many fires were lit, the cold had refused to leave. Miriam had stopped speaking entirely. Her hands, once always moving with thread or ladle, had rested idle in her lap, her eyes vacant and unblinking. On the morning of March 3rd, she had been found seated in her chair by the window, unmoving, her breath gone, her body still warm. No mark had been left upon her, only the faint trace of a smile that did not belong to her. The family had buried her beside Silas beneath the elm. Elias had not wept, his hands had trembled as he dug, but his face had remained as stone. When the soil had been packed down, he had stood in silence for nearly an hour before returning to the house. Inside, the air had seemed different, heavier, more aware. That night, something had been written across the ceiling beams in soot. "I have what I came for, but I will not leave." Margaret's voice had ceased. Her eyes had finally closed. She had been laid in her bed, pale as snow, her limbs folded as if posed. She had not responded to any stimulus, but her heart had continued to beat, slow and steady, like the ticking of a forgotten clock. Josiah had awoken the following week with both feet blistered, as if scorched by coals, though his room had remained untouched. Ruth had gone missing for nearly a day and been discovered behind the cave entrance, standing still, her hands clasped over her ears. She had been unable to speak for 3 days afterward. Elias, worn and hollowed by loss, had prepared to leave. Plans had been made, bags packed, the house had been stripped of all but necessities. But on the morning they were to depart, the wagon's wheels had been found shattered. The front door had vanished, its frame sealed with boards that had never been nailed by human hands. From within the hearth, laughter had bloomed once more. It had echoed through the rooms, layered and distant, as if coming from beneath the floor and above the ceiling at once. The children had screamed. Elias had collapsed, his knees failing beneath him. That night, he had taken the ledger, written a final entry with shaking hands, and placed it beneath the floorboard where the tooth had once fallen. Then he had gathered his children in the parlor, bolted every window, and sat with them through the dark. When morning had come, the sun had risen blood red over the mountains. The house had stood silent. No breath had stirred within. Years had passed before the structure had been rediscovered. Its windows had long since shattered. Moss had grown thick along its walls. The elm behind it had died, its trunk hollowed and charred. A team of local men, seeking timber from the forgotten land, had approached cautiously. Their axes had been sharp, their minds skeptical. They had stepped inside to find furniture intact, the hearth cold, and the scent of mildew heavy. In the corner of the room, a chair had remained turned toward the window. Beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth, the ledger had been found. Its pages had been stiff with age but legible. The final words, etched in trembling script, had read, "She was not buried, she was bound, and we unbound her." No further entries had followed. In the decades that came after, no family had remained on the land for more than a season. Children had spoken of shadows on the ceiling, of hair being pulled, of voices whispering beneath their pillows. Animals had refused to cross the boundary of the forest. Locals had begun to refer to the place only as the Hollowing House. And on certain nights, when the sky turned colorless and the wind held its breath, a single phrase could still be heard from the edge of the trees, spoken not aloud, but felt inside the chest like a memory never lived. "I am the air, I am the walls, I am the silence you try to forget." In the early hours of a damp spring morning, a thin fog had clung low to the undergrowth of Evershade National Reserve, wrapping itself around each tree root like a sleeping thing. Silence had not been expected, yet the forest had offered no birdsong, no chirping insects, not even the familiar rustle of deer or fox. At the center of that silence, beneath a weather-worn watchtower, a notice had been posted without ceremony. If a tree is seen uprooting itself and walking, report immediately. Do not engage. Do not film. Do not follow. No name had been signed beneath the warning. No official seal pressed into the laminated page. It had been stapled at a slight angle, its corners lifting in the morning dew. That message had been read and discarded by a young content creator named Ellis Brandt. Drawn to the legend by the promise of clicks, he had arrived 3 days prior to record content for his growing live stream channel. The warning had been taken as bait, one more quirky tale for the internet to consume. His first 2 days had passed without incident. Campfires had been lit, coffee had been brewed, drone footage had been taken, edited and scheduled for upload. Trees had stood still. The trails had been quiet, and yet something had been wrong. Ellis had not noticed the difference at first. It had begun with the wind, how it had moved high in the treetops but left the lower branches still. Later, during his second night, one of his motion sensor alarms had been triggered, though nothing had been found nearby. The soil had been undisturbed. No tracks had been left. The live stream had begun on a Tuesday afternoon, Clouds had gathered overhead in sluggish masses, but no rain had fallen. The air had carried the smell of wet bark and something sweeter, decay, like spoiled fruit left too long in a closed room. Jokes had been made. The warning sign had been filmed and mocked. Trees had been narrated as characters, given crude nicknames, insulted for the entertainment of a chat that never saw the forest firsthand. And then something had been seen. At first, it had been passed off as a glitch in the camera. One of the trees in the distance had swayed, not with the wind, but against it, jerking in one deliberate motion, then stilling. Ellis had laughed. The camera had been adjusted. Then a tremor had passed beneath his boots. Not an earthquake, not a vibration, but a single thudding pulse. It had felt like a heartbeat, buried deep beneath the forest floor. In the clearing ahead, a birch tree had moved, not swayed, not cracked or bent, moved. Roots had lifted like blackened fingers, heavy with mud. The trunk had tilted, then pivoted. Bark had split with the sound of tearing leather. No leaves had fallen, no branches had snapped. The tree had taken a single step, an impossible, deliberate act, and then vanished beyond the mist. Where it had stood, there had remained only churned soil and a cratered absence. Silence had returned, deeper than before. The camera had continued to stream, but no more jokes had been made. Ellis had run. His backpack had been left behind. Equipment had been abandoned. The trail had been followed, then lost. Trees had seemed closer than before, leaning, arching inward. Paths had narrowed. Landmarks had vanished. By the time he had reached the forest edge, darkness had begun to settle across the canopy like a heavy lid. The air had felt thicker. Breathing had become laborious, as though each inhale had been borrowed. The ranger's station had been locked. No lights had burned within. The door had been hammered upon. No answer had come. Later that night, a report had been filed online from a nearby motel. Ellis had not returned to Evershade. Sleep had not come easily after the escape. The motel bed had remained untouched through the first night. The blinds had been drawn tight, yet the room had seemed exposed, vulnerable to eyes that couldn't be seen, but had still been felt. The live-stream footage had been reviewed in the dim glow of a laptop screen. Every frame had been watched. No editing had been done. The birch tree's movement had been there. Clear, deliberate, recorded from 3 angles due to the accidental activation of the backup drone feed. It had not been an illusion, not a trick of the eye. The roots had been filmed as they tore from the ground. The hollow had remained behind, gaping like a wound. And yet, when the video had been uploaded, only static had appeared. The timestamp had remained, the length intact, but the file itself had been corrupted. Every backup had mirrored the same corruption. A screeching sound had replaced the audio, slow and jagged, like wind howling through wet reeds. Screens had flickered, devices had overheated, the footage had been deleted. The story had been written off as performance art, but the eyes had never left. Even in the days that followed, as Ellis had returned to the city and rejoined the thrum of urban noise, the sense of being watched had remained. A pressure at the base of the skull, a tugging at the corners of peripheral vision. Trees near his apartment had seemed closer each morning. Branches had shifted places. A knot in one oak trunk had taken the shape of an open mouth. At night, dreams had been invaded. In one, roots had sprouted from the bed frame and coiled around his limbs, holding him fast while something enormous waited outside the window. In another, a forest had grown inside the walls, leaves brushing against wallpaper, soil rising through the floorboards. By the end of the week, hairline cracks had formed in the plaster above his bedroom door. Sap had leaked through them, thick, dark, and warm to the touch. He had returned to the ranger's notice online, but the document had vanished. No archived version had remained. No official website had acknowledged it. The ranger station itself had been listed as unmanned until further notice. Still, Reports had surfaced in hidden forums. Other visitors had claimed strange experiences in Evershade, accounts buried beneath warnings and sarcasm. One had mentioned trees with hollowed centers that whispered at night. Another had described footsteps that left no prints. A third had posted a photograph of a clearing where no sunlight reached, even at noon. That post had since been deleted. The account had gone dark. Ellis had begun to collect these fragments, pinning them across a wall like an investigator in a case no one believed had occurred. Threads had been drawn between testimonies. Locations had been triangulated. Patterns had emerged. Always the same phrases had appeared. The forest moved. The trees weren't where they'd been the day before. Something had followed me home. Desperation had bloomed slowly, in silence. No amount of online validation had undone the pull. The feeling that the forest had not let go. And then one morning, the tree had arrived. It had not been noticed at first. The window of the apartment had framed the same view for years. Alley, dumpster, a single power pole. But on that day, just beyond the chain link fence, a tree had stood where none had been before. Not tall, not wide, just wrong. The bark had been damp, despite the dry weather. Its roots had rested on the concrete as though grown there overnight. No saplings had surrounded it. No birds had landed in its branches. The leaves had not rustled in the wind. They had remained still, listening. Neighbors had not mentioned it. Groundskeepers had walked past without acknowledgement. Yet each day, the tree had stood closer. The third morning, it had brushed against the window pane. The glass had not broken. It had bowed inward, softly. A single crack had traced along the bottom edge, thin and trembling. That night, soil had been found in the hallway, small clumps, scattered like breadcrumbs. A trail had led from the elevator to the front door. No prints had been found. No smell had lingered. Only the earth, dark, wet, and pulsing with a subtle warmth. Ellis had moved out the next day. A temporary refuge had been found in a furnished sublet on the far edge of the city, an aging building with windows too narrow for comfort and radiators that hissed in protest each night. No trees had grown nearby. Concrete had stretched in every direction. The nearest park had been miles away. It had seemed safe, but safety had not followed. Boxes had remained unpacked. Mirrors had been covered. All digital equipment had been powered down, unplugged, and sealed in a bin lined with salt and steel filings. Folklore forums had warned of such measures, though no one had agreed on why they mattered. Some had spoken of ley lines. Others had mentioned ancient rituals buried beneath centuries of forest rot. All had sounded unhinged. And yet, the salt had been spread along every windowsill. The dreams had returned within 48 hours. One had shown the inside of the original forest, not from a human view, but from beneath. A network of roots had pulsed just under the surface, vast and slow and alive. Shapes had moved between them, not insects, not vermin, something older, something with purpose. In another dream, the city itself had become covered in moss. Buildings had been reduced to trunks. Streets had turned to mud. A tree had stood in every window. Each had watched motionless. During waking hours, hallucinations had begun. Elevators had opened to reveal wooded paths. Water from the faucet had carried the scent of pine sap. On one occasion, a knot of bark had been found beneath the sink. It had crumbled to the touch, releasing a faint whisper that had lingered in the corners of the room long after. Every surface had begun to feel like wood. Attempts had been made to leave. First the apartment, then the city. Flights had been booked, then canceled. Taxi drivers had failed to show. Roads had become blocked by construction or traffic or accident. One morning, every road on the GPS had rerouted back to the original forest coordinates, Evershade National Reserve. The signal had been traced. No origin had been found. Internet connections had become unreliable. Files had become corrupted. When digital maps had been opened, trees had appeared where cities should have stood, spreading pixel by pixel, replacing roads with branches, buildings with bark. Reality had begun to warp. On the third night in the new apartment, the hallway had groaned, not with footsteps, but with weight, a shifting, wooden weight, like beams bending under strain. The sound had not come from the floor. It had come from inside the walls. A soft tapping had started soon after, slow, deliberate, always just behind the headboard, or the bathroom mirror, or the closet door. The pattern had resembled root movement, a spiraling rhythm, like something burrowing with intelligence. And then there had been the whisper, not in the room, not in the hallway, inside the skull. It had not been words, not at first, just the sensation of being spoken to, an invasion of thought, moist and cold and deep. Over time, meaning had emerged. You saw, you laughed, you belong. That night, the walls had bled sap again. It had oozed from the corners of the ceiling, down through the plaster. Dark, sticky streaks had run along the floor and pooled near the mattress. The smell had been unbearable, sweet, rotted, ancient. It had sunk into the skin, the clothes, the lungs. Panic had followed. Bags had been packed in blind desperation. Salt had been scattered in wide arcs. All cameras had been smashed. Notebooks had been burned. But when the door had opened, the tree had been there again, no longer outside, not behind the building. Inside, its bark had been soaked, cracked, pulsing. Roots had threaded through the baseboards, coiling along the tiles like veins. Its trunk had split upward into the ceiling, disappearing into the floor of the unit above. No light had touched it. No shadow had been cast. It had done nothing. It had only waited. At some point, time had lost its sequence. Morning and night had blurred. Windows had stopped reflecting. Clocks had continued to tick, but the hands had moved in slow, uneven pulses, as though resisting the very notion of forward movement. The tree had grown taller. Its branches had spread across the ceiling, splitting plaster, displacing wires, threading into the bones of the building itself. Bark had crept along the walls like a second skin. Every surface had become covered in a fine dust of pollen and mold. Outside, the city had carried on. At least, that's what had been assumed. No confirmation had been possible. The windows had become occluded, fogged with a resinous film that allowed light, but no image. The door had refused to open, not locked, not jammed, absorbed. The apartment had become a forest. Light had filtered in through cracks in the bark overhead, golden green and flickering, as if through leaves. The air had grown thick with oxygen and the hum of unseen insects. Ferns had sprouted from power outlets. Mushrooms had pushed up between the tiles. Roots had pulsed beneath the bed. Ellis had no longer remained alone, not in the traditional sense, not with people, but presence had returned, first as movement, just outside of vision, then as breathing behind the walls, then as soundless footfalls across the ceiling, too heavy to be human, and finally, as something inside the mirror. The reflection had begun to lag behind, subtle at first, then grotesque. Eyes had stared back too long, head tilts had been delayed. Sometimes, no reflection had appeared at all. Other times, it had smiled. The voice had grown stronger. It had no longer needed sleep to enter the mind. Waking thoughts had been interrupted. Memories had become overwritten. The voice had repeated itself again and again, gently, like a lullaby wrapped in vines. You were warned. You brought them attention. Now you carry them forward. And then the voice had said something else, something final. You are the next tree. On the final day, Ellis had awakened to silence. Not the absence of sound, but the completion of it. The apartment had stood empty. The branches had receded. The roots had dried. Even the smell of bark had faded. All had been quiet, still, hollow. A single piece of paper had rested on the floor. Its surface had been torn yellowed with age, yet the ink had remained fresh. The message had been identical to the original sign at the ranger post, but written in a different hand, scratched into the page, as though by something without fingers. If you see a tree walking, do not film it, do not follow it, do not run, plant yourself in silence. Months later, a new ranger had arrived at Evershade National Reserve. No reports had been found on file. No missing persons alerts had been flagged. The woods had seemed still, and yet deeper in the forest, a new tree had been growing, not planted, not native, just standing. Its bark had been smooth and pale, as if formed not from age, but memory. A small silver camera lens had been embedded in the trunk, almost fully absorbed, and at its roots, buried beneath the moss, a faded motel receipt had been pressed into the earth, dated 6 months prior. Name barely legible, a brand. No birds had landed on that tree. No animal had touched it. The forest around it had fallen silent, and when the wind had passed, the tree had not moved. It had listened.